Okay, so this is my first official post on here, but I have to share this story. It happened about 3 years ago. I live in the United States. I was a 6'1", 210-pound, 21-year-old white male college student that was living in a predominantly Hispanic, low-income neighborhood when this occurred. About 5 minutes after my Pizza Hut shift one night, I decided to walk across the street to buy a couple tall boys at my local liquor store, excited about it being the weekend and getting to sleep in the next morning. I know, I had no life. So, as the cashier was handing me my bag of booze across the counter, a muffled, yet short female scream reverberated throughout the store just from outside. I distinctly remember how pitiful it sounded. The cashier and I made that certain eye contact where you're both just like, what just happened? After a brief silence, he just shrugs his shoulders slowly and tells me to be careful getting home. I nod my head and start out after giving him a gracias from over my shoulder. I know it seems like we may have underreacted, but honestly, you see and hear a lot of crazy things in this city, especially at night. So in addition to not wanting to get mixed up in something, you don't just call the cops over anything, especially a random scream. Even with that being said, thinking about how pitiful it sounded gave me a mixture of disgusted anger and cold fear. My heart speeding up at this point, I opened the liquor store door slightly and looked out around outside, and after hearing and seeing nothing but traffic for about 15 seconds, I decided to start walking home, head down, eyes and ears open. But as soon as I rounded the liquor store corner, I was greeted by an obviously intoxicated, but somehow steady, short, stocky Hispanic man with a scratched up face and really stretched out shirt. Assuming he was one of the few drunks that live in a small but dense patch of forest out about 12 feet behind the store, I completely disregarded him and continued walking. At first, something about his behavior caught my attention. He looked extremely nervous and as if he were up to something. Also, I could hear a faint, almost non-existent gurgle-like sound coming from in the trees. Immediately, I began to suspect he had something to do with the scream I'd heard just minutes before. Upon making eye contact, he caught on fast that I suspected him. I said, "Hello, how are you?" He awkwardly asked me, smiling way too much and motioning for me to follow him into the darkness behind the store. I pretty much told him to screw off and continued walking home at a much faster pace now, looking behind me every 16 or so steps. I began wondering what the heck that noise was coming from in the woods and why the man was acting so shady. Maybe I was overreacting though. Maybe the sound was just an old pipe or drain nearby. Maybe he really was just drunk and didn't want me to call the cops on him for public intoxication or something. I now wish with everything within me I would have called the police then and there and went back into the store and waited. About 5 minutes later, while walking down the particularly dark and isolated stretch of road about half a mile before my apartments, out of nowhere, the man I'd just seen burst through some shrubbery about 12 feet from me on my back left wielding a machete. That's right, a freaking machete. Honestly, you can't make this up. I immediately went into panic mode and threw my beers at him and began running as fast as my legs would carry me toward my apartment building, hoping I had enough strength left within me to make it. I now realized I should have ran back toward the store as it was closer, but as I stated, he came from behind me and the rest is instinct. He was initially so close behind me, I swear I could hear the blade cutting the air as he swung at me from behind. I honestly expected a machete blow to the neck or head at any second. That's a very unique, very hard state of mind to be in, knowing that you could die at any moment. The worst, most gruesome thoughts of me being murdered began to fill my mind. Would I trip, only to have a defensive arm hacked off right before my eyes? Or would I be halfway decapitated mid-stride, falling hard and bleeding out as other parts of my body were cut away? Tears began to fill my eyes at the thought of how my family would feel knowing I was hacked to death, bleeding out on the side of a dark road, alone. I began to scream, half out of desperation to live, the other half out of fear of not wanting to die such a horrible death. I know I sound like a sissy, but you can't really judge until you're being chased down by someone who literally wants to hack apart your body until you die. I'll try to shorten the story a little now. Yes, I eventually made it home. Some part of me knew I'd lost the guy way before getting there, but my fear and adrenaline refused to let me stop running. I collapsed as soon as I'd made it inside, and tried to focus on not going into cardiac arrest from not only running so hard, but out of fear for my life. I tried to remember everything I'd learned in the army about 2-mile recovery drills. It helped a little. Anyone who's been in even a remotely similar situation can understand why I never called the police. After much needed water and heavy breathing, it was 30 minutes before I could even put a chain of complete rational thoughts together due to the shock and mental or physical exhaustion caused by whatever just happened. By which time the guy would have been long gone anyways. I remember all I could think about was how the heck I didn't hear him getting that close to me after 5 whole minutes of walking, especially with him being under the influence and me being sober. Needless to say, after double checking all the doors and windows, I fell into a paranoid sleep, gripping a kitchen knife soon after. The next day I came to find that a young teenage girl had been raped and killed behind the same store around the time I had been leaving the previous night. Her throat had been slit and her body dumped not far from where she'd been assaulted. Every person that lived behind the store was tested against the male fluids found inside the girl's body, and not one was a match. As far as I know, the guy has never been caught. I'm 120% sure that the scratched face and stretched shirt on the man I'd seen the previous night were remnants of the poor girl's futile attempts to fight off her killer, and that the suspicion he saw on me was enough for him to want to kill me, as he must have thought I was a witness or something. The mother of the child had only sent her there to buy some orange juice for something she'd been making for dinner that night. The liquor store was the closest carrier of OJ in the area. I can't help but kind of feel guilty though, and I feel so horrible for the girl's family, especially the mother. If I'd called the police then and there and went back inside, would he have been caught? I remind myself that things played out the way they did and that I can't change the past. The worst part, though, is thinking that the gurgling sound I'd heard was the girl trying to breathe despite choking on her own blood mere yards from me. I'm almost certain this is true. Also, who just carries around a damn machete? Is that what he used to cut the girl's throat? Nevertheless, Michael Myers' machete-wielding assaultist, let's never ever meet again. I don't usually do this, but this has traumatized me for a while, so I'm gonna get it out of my system. When I was 16 years old, I lived in a rural area in England, in a small village, if you can call it that, as it was nothing more than a bunch of houses with a small store. The closest school was the next town over, and that was half an hour away, so every morning I would have to get up at 6 a.m. to catch the bus, and yes, it sucked. But it wasn't all bad, because of the 2 other kids who lived there who were close to my age, Connor and Courtney. Names have been changed for this story. Courtney was the year below me and Connor was in my class. We got the bus together every morning, and over the weekends and holidays we would hang out together at each other's houses or loiter around the shop until we got kicked out. Anyway, at the time I had a cat which I had gotten for my 15th birthday. His name was King because he looked like a king. He was a huge white cat with green eyes and an attitude. I loved that cat so much so that when he went missing, it messed me up pretty good. I spent weeks crying my eyes out waiting for him to come home, but he never did. Soon it began going around that a lot of the neighbors' cats had been disappearing as well. None of them had been found on the road, so people assumed that a fox had got them. It was the weekend, and me, Connor, and Courtney had decided that we were bored of hanging around Courtney's. So we decided to go exploring, which meant that we would walk along the back roads until we were completely lost, and then try and find our way back. It was stupid, but fun. Anyway, we were going up a back road we had never been on, when we came across a pathway leading off the road. It was unkept and looked like nobody had used it for years. We went down the path, excited to see where it led, and we were even more excited when we found an old rundown house at the end of it. The door was open and barely standing. Connor carefully moved it aside and we went in. The smell was putrid, and I'm pretty sure I retched a little. Everything was filthy and falling apart. Just being there gave me a weird sick feeling in my stomach. Something didn't feel right. Courtney must have felt it too because she immediately began complaining that we should leave. I would have left if I hadn't been trying to impress Connor, who at the time I had a huge crush on. So instead of agreeing with her, Connor and I called her a little sissy and teased her until she agreed to come with us through the rest of the house. We went through what looked like a living room, but it was covered in dirt and piles of trash. The smell got worse as we made it to the bottom of the stairs. Courtney made it clear that she didn't want to go up there, but when we told her to wait for us there, she made it even clearer that she didn't want to do that either. So we all went up together, Courtney clinging to my arm and me clinging to Connor, who went up first. At the top of the stairs, there was a corridor door with about 3 rooms in it. It was just as filthy as downstairs, and the smell was 10 times worse though. We piled into the first room we came to, pushing Connor in first, only for him to freeze. I looked over his shoulder and I nearly puked. The room was full of decomposing bodies of what looked to be cats, all piled up against the wall. The stench was horrendous. I heard Connor whisper, "Oh crap," under his breath, and I guess Courtney, who was outside the room, heard too because she loudly began asking what it was, but before I could tell her to shut up, from the corner of the room came something flying through the air. It hit Connor straight in the chest and fell to the floor. It was a decaying cat corpse, and it was followed by a deranged scream of "Get out!" And from out of the same corner stumbled a filthy old man. He began to stagger towards us. We immediately got out of there, and I don't remember much about it, other than me and Courtney screaming our heads off and me tripping over one of the door frames on our way out. We ran until we couldn't run anymore. Luckily, we remembered our way back, but it took us about 30 minutes to get back home. And in that time, we speed walked as fast as we could, jumping at every sound and, of course, on my part, crying as I repeatedly asked him if he thought my cat was in there. Connor just kept replying that he didn't know and asking me if I thought the man had followed us. We finally made it back and ran to the closest house which one of us lived in, and that was Courtney's. We hurriedly explained what happened, and Courtney's mom called my mother, Connor's mother, and then the police, who came by a couple of hours later and took statements. Connor told me that they came back a few days later and said that the cats were there, but there was no sign of the man. When I was visiting my mother earlier this month, my boyfriend and I went to check out the house, but it had been knocked down. I have no idea what that man was doing there that day, or if he had killed all the cats, but I have a feeling that my cat was somewhere within those corpses, and it still makes me sick to this day. There are some messed up people out there. When I was 16 years old, I played in a band with some friends from school. Our drummer Randy's family lived at the top of a mountain, about 10 miles out of town, and we practiced in a little building on their property to avoid the noise complaints we would surely get in town. The mountain was a labyrinth of unpaved roads, and the few houses there were separated from each other by stretches of dense forest. I had met a few of Randy's neighbors, and they mostly seemed like normal people who just wanted to live closer to nature. However, Randy's stepdad, Jack, a 6'5", tattooed ex-biker, warned us that he had heard stories of people moving there to hide their drug operations deep in the woods. Around this time, I had started dating a new girl, but because of her strict family, we only had been able to see each other at school. However, it turned out she had a friend who lived at the same mountain as Randy. She decided to sleep over at her house on a Friday so that I could come and see her there after practice. I passed the direction she gave me on to Randy, and while he seemed uncertain about them, he agreed to help me find the house. After band rehearsal broke up that Friday, Randy and I got in my car and started trying to follow my girlfriend's directions. After the first couple of turns, we were on a road lined with tall trees that completely blotted out the moonlight. We were supposed to turn off of that road somewhere, but between the darkness and my girlfriend's vague directions, we had no idea which of the several narrow paths leading farther off into the woods was actually the right one. So, after a few minutes, we decided we must have missed the road. So I turned around at the first house I saw to take another look. Once again, we couldn't decide which road was the one we were looking for. Not wanting to take a wrong turn and end up in the middle of someone's private property in the dead of night, we turned around at another house to make one more pass. It wasn't long after that I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw a pair of headlights closing in quickly, much more quickly than was reasonable on this rough dirt road in the pitch blackness. I mentioned this to Randy, but he waved it off. Probably just some crazy redneck, he said, not exactly easing my nerves. Just let them pass. I slowed to a crawl and pulled as close to the side of the road as I safely could, waiting on the car to pass. Instead of going around, though, it got right on my bumper. At this point, we were starting to panic, and I was becoming convinced that we had somehow upset one of the drug dealers Jack had warned us about. I sped up, and the car kept pace. When I accelerated even more, they finally passed. But rather than continuing on, the driver performed a perfect bootleg turn, sliding to a stop a few yards ahead, now facing my car with their high beams on. Needless to say, Randy and I were losing it, screaming random obscenities for a few seconds before either of us was able to think straight. Summoning a driving skill I didn't know I had, I threw the car into reverse and floored it, and somehow managed to get turned around in the direction of Randy's house without ending up in the ditch. I think I took the other driver by surprise, because we had a pretty good head start before he took off in pursuit. At the speed we were going, it only took a couple of minutes to get back to Randy's house, but the other car tailed us the whole way. We whipped into the driveway, almost jumping out of my car before it had stopped, and the other vehicle, which I can now see was a police car with the lights and markings removed, slid to a stop behind us, blocking us in. Randy and I sprinted for the front door, and did the only thing we could think to do in our panicked state. We yelled for Jack to come and save us. Jack, who was sitting in his recliner, watching TV and wearing only a pair of shorts, calmly got up and walked out onto the front porch. As he did so, a chubby old man, probably in his late 50s, climbed out of the other car, but immediately stopped behind his open door when he saw the big, half-naked biker dude who was now standing between him and us. It only took a couple of questions from Jack, who was a nice guy, but scary when he wanted to be, before our pursuer was reduced to stammering nervously. It turns out that, unknown to me, both times I had turned around it had been in his driveway. After seeing my headlights for the second time, he decided to chase us down, assuming we were up to something illegal. After explaining himself, he angrily informed us that he was a retired state trooper and that he had been radioed for the police to come and arrest us for trespassing. He then jumped back into his car and took off. Unsurprisingly, no police ever arrived, and we ended up laughing the whole thing off as a random encounter with a crazy but harmless old man. Still, it was enough to scare me into never venturing too far from Randy's house again when I was on the mountain. Let's start by talking about my friend, Stacy. Stacy is one of those names that is mostly used on girls, but once in a while some poor bloke would get stuck with it. Stacy, like I, was mentally handicapped. I'm bipolar and Asperger's syndrome. He's paranoid, schizophrenic, and bipolar. Together in high school, we ran and curated a clique for autistic kids. We're polar opposites, no pun intended, but we're like brothers. We're so close, in fact, that most people in our town think that we're dating and have been dating since grade 8. We constantly get asked what date we're tying the knot, and as a joke to perpetuate this rumor, hold hands in public. Another member of our group we'll call Luis. Luis was Mexican. His family came from Mexico, bought and renovated a dilapidated mosque, and turned it into their own private hacienda. When I say private, I mean it. They have one heck of a security system. It has so many locks you basically have to have a conference call with every member of the family before they unlock the door. Then you get re-interviewed by his mother and can still get the door slammed in your face. Louis' family was strict Catholic. His mom was almost as extreme as a Westboro Baptist churchgoer. Despite this, Louis was a good bloke. He was intelligent and kind. He could party with the best of them. At house parties, while we were all casually smoking from our pipes like Sherlock Holmes, he would lug an entire Cool Whip container of weed or corn husks, then lie on the ground laughing, grabbing himself and trying to form consonants. We'd jokingly say, "Come on, Louise, use your big boy words." I know, we're kinda rude. I remember one time at a metal festival put on by local bands, I was having a beer and talking with the promoters when, after 6 hours in there, Louise emerges from the mosh pit with his nose actually split. There was a 3/4 inch hole separating his bridge from the middle of his nose, blood gushing out, and he just walked over to a mirror by me and said, "Darcy, I think I need a hospital." The promoters and organizers offered to drive him, and he said, "What? Not now. I'm going back in," before taking off his shirt, tying it around his face, and jumping back in. He wasn't just a party boy. He was relatively intelligent and a good critical thinker. I know on more than one occasion we'd stay up working all night on a problem, and he'd come in there and within 3 seconds have the blindingly obvious answer we somehow didn't get. We loved Louise. So, this was a Sunday right before grade 12 prom. Stacy and I met up at 8 a.m. and played Mario Kart all day, trolled around on Chatterbait and Omegle, but by 3 p.m. we were bored. We thought, let's cruise with Louise, and that's what we went to do. Louise's block wasn't bad. He was a few blocks from the white supremacists and Crips. There was a few drug dealer houses, but the nice dudes who never attracted the really bad crowd, and a soup kitchen attached to a church right by. We ring him and get the response I expected, which was his mom screaming, "Get away! Leave my boy alone, he's a good boy," in her very typical Mexican accent. Bored again, we, not sure what to do, just walked back to my car. As we did, this tall, lanky man started following a block behind. He was white, his head was misshapen, his ears huge, and the rest of his head in the shape of a cashew. His lips were engorged. I assumed he was the product of incest and just ripped my cap to him and kept moving. Speaking of tipping my cap, I used to emulate Winston Churchill and therefore always wore a bowler hat wherever I went. The man following us was clearly drugged out of his mind. He was dressed like a farmer from the 30s. His clothes seemed to be at least that old and hadn't been washed since then. Darcy, Stacy muttered under his breath, "Is the meathead following us?" I very quietly breathed. Stacy breathed. We kept close and picked up the pace. Only 5 blocks to the car. A few seconds later, Stacy turns to me. "Oh God, look," he breathes. As I turn to look behind me, I hear the click followed by a ping. "The meth head has a switch," I said. "Oh, well, he's probably getting ready to trim the verge." 3 blocks to go. We begin walking on our toes, barely breathing, listening as the smack of shoes on the pavement gets quicker and quicker. I turn back, watching him speed walk towards us, and wait to see if he's actually a threat and scream, "Run!" Stacy and I perk up running. The meth head is seething in anger, looking like he just popped a blood vessel as he's chewing on the side of his mouth. He begins running and quick. There's no terror like watching an incestuous meth head turn into Jesse Owens. It's just pure terror. This dude is running like he's in the Olympics. He wants us and he's not stopping at anything. We slide through the end of the block and take an extreme right to end up at my 1978 Delta. But I've never been more happy to see that old beast. We get in, and as we're pulling away, this guy collides wrist first with our back door. As we reach the intersection a few feet away, he stumbles up from the ground and begins shouting. He then throws his knife at us and we drive away. I don't know what this dude was on. I don't know what happened to him and why we didn't call the cops because, well, they don't care. We just went to a local hipster cafe, got some food, and got back to Stacy's uncle's place to find his brother had some people over, ready to get into a 5-person Mario Party, so we relaxed and chilled till early morning. Final note, I never saw Louise again. It's too bad. Like most grads of our high school, there are stories. He's in college in Lethbridge. He's on drugs. He's selling drugs and making rap music. The rumor I like is that he cleaned up his act, got his life on track, and is working to a better life, just like me. I've contacted him. No response, though. Stacy says they chill on and off, but I can't validate that, and neither can anyone else. I'd like to see him again and take him out for a coffee or tea or protein shake or whatever he drinks and just spend a few hours catching up. There's nothing like home, right? Well, it depends. Depends who you share your accommodation with. Sometimes we complain about housemates that don't wash their dishes or that leave a mess in the communal space. My case was a bit different. I lived with someone a bit more extreme than a lazy person. His name is James. At the time, he was 32 years old, a fatty, bold guy that used to smell of pepperoni pizza. He's been eating pepperoni pizza for months, the cheap frozen quality in packs of 3. Sometimes he would eat the 3 pizza one after the other and never brush his teeth. In fact, you could smell his breath from across the living room. He was a brilliant jazz pianist and it was really cool jamming with him. I play guitar. The fun part was only in playing music, nothing else, as his head was often up above in the clouds. There was a time where, here in England, magic mushrooms were legal, and even in places like Camden Town, London, you'd have been able to buy them almost everywhere. Even if they say that magic mushrooms are safe, any drug abuse leads to some sort of dementia at the end. Our house was a bit away from transports and shops, so that most of the people who rented a room didn't stay for too long, just for the time being until they would have found a better place. Also, the house was a bit old and smelly. However, this wasn't the only problem. The problem was James. He was annoying. He would constantly ask to borrow money from the tenants and leave a mess everywhere around the house. I learned how to deal with him. Like, if he would ask for money, I'd say, "Later I'm going to the shop. I'll pop at the cash machine and get something." Then I would pretend to forget and find similar excuses just to avoid to say no. The rent was very cheap and I would be cycling everywhere I needed to go, so the location of the house wasn't a problem for me. Things started to take the wrong turn when a couple of girls moved into the house. He would walk around the house naked, just covered with a towel, and accidentally drop it whenever he would meet them, and he would just smile. The first time it happened, I laughed it off. Seeing the face of the girl totally embarrassed in front of this round, pink, bold, sweaty, hairless guy was too funny not to laugh at, but by the third time it happened, I started to feel very creeped out. It had happened a few times when I was in the kitchen talking to the girls. He would just walk in, drop his towel, smile, try to make conversation, but we would just leave the room feeling uncomfortable of what we had just witnessed. It probably happened lots of times. I only saw it happening 3 or 4 times. It's not all. When the girls would literally run away when they saw him, he would chase them up the stairs and confessed his love for them, which it would creep them out even more. I can't imagine how disgusting it must have been for these girls to be tormented in this way. I'm not too sure exactly when I reckoned it was time to move out for me too, but in one occasion, while talking to my next house neighbor, a very nice elderly lady, she told me she saw him once dancing in the garden, or doing some sort of ritual. He was completely naked, all covered of engine oil, wearing a pair of knickers in his head and singing some made-out Arabic song. I tried to be reassuring to her, saying maybe he was just doing a video, as he used to play a lot with an old Super 8 camera, but of course I knew I wasn't doing any video. He probably was completely out of his trolley, trying to scare the neighbors with his weirdness. That was something I couldn't excuse or even laugh about. An alarm bell started ringing in my head. He wasn't just a pervert, he was crazy. He had a cat, and the cat used to bring little bunnies inside the house. Of course the bunnies would have been badly hurt. That's what cats do, but they don't kill or eat them. They just play with these little creatures. I knew a vet that used to rescue bunnies for free. He had a garden full of them. But James seemed like he loved finishing the bunnies by snapping their neck off and dumped them in the field near their house. In the field there was a playground for kids, so I imagined that some kids would just encounter some of his dead bunnies while walking in the park. He also used to do stupid things like asking to borrow a lighter, light up his rolling cigarette, and pocketing the lighter right in front of the person he just borrowed it from. He was a complete embarrassment to have around and a nightmare to live with. There are so many stories to tell. They all happened in the course of 10 months that I lost the chronology of the events. Like the day I came back from Glastonbury Festival to find him naked sleeping in my bed. I remember shouting for him to leave my room, but he wouldn't. I was so furious that I called the police before I would bash him with a metal bar of the scaffolds abandoned in the garden. But guess what the police told me? Note, it was 3 at night. They told me, "You are both adults, you should be able to deal peacefully." Well, so, forget the police. I started wrecking his room to get him out of mine. And it worked. Seriously, what would you have done? Cooking my own meal was also always something to be careful of. I had to be present in the kitchen at all times, or he would just spoon the food straight from the pot into his mouth when I wasn't there. Taking a bath after he did was also as disgusting as using the toilet after he used it. You don't want me to be descriptive there. You know very well what it's like to have a bath filled with pubic hair and brown spots of you-know-what. And you know how disgusting it is to flush somebody else's feces. I now live on my own, and I have absolutely no intentions to share my flat with anybody. I wished I would be able to tell these stories in a better way, but English is not my first language, and honestly, I would like to forget about this terrible experience. Allow me to advise you this, though. If you need to share rent with someone, make sure it's not a weirdo.